Story 1. A buddy of mine was cat sitting for a friend of his while the other guy was out of town on a vacation. My buddy did not have a car, so the dude told him that if he needed to go out and pick up more cat food or anything, he could borrow the car. At the time, my buddy was living right down the street from the guy, staying at his parents' house, so my buddy was just going over for a few hours each day just to feed the cat, keep it company, then going back home. Meanwhile, he's also been flirting with this woman online. She lives several states away, but he feels like they've seemed to be getting pretty serious, so he decides to take some liberties, really push the envelope on where he'll pick up a cat food from them, and he takes his friend's car on a little, multi-state road trip. This is insane, right? Just atrociously bad judgment, especially since someone does not need to feed the cat. To solve this, he left his parents a note. It reads, "I'm camping in the woods behind our house. Please go over and feed his cat. I'll let you know when I'm home." Boom. Problem solved, right? Except that the quote woods behind our house are about 20 yards deep. It takes less than 5 minutes to walk through them and come out in the neighboring housing development, so his parents went to look for him, calling out for him, and obviously could not find him. They get worried and contacted a family friend and a local police officer. He subsequently got a hold of the fire department, and there was a full-on search party, combing through about 1/50th acre of woods. Unsurprisingly, they came up with nothing. This was before cell phones were common, so my buddy was completely unaware that his plan had fallen apart. He was cruising along on his 12-hour drive, expecting to get to his girl's house just in time for dinner. Except he didn't have a GPS, so he got lost. Very lost. Like, by the time he turned up at this woman's house, it was almost midnight lost. When he gets there, she's crying her eyes out. He assured her that it was okay, he was fine, wasn't hurt or in a wreck or anything. He just got lost, and she said, No, I wasn't worried about you. My dad just died in an accident." So, he bailed on his cat-sitting duties, stole a car, and inspired his parents to file a missing persons just so he could awkwardly watch a woman cry for a few hours and then drive back home. Story number 2. Arrived from work one day, and my house reeks of oil. Go into the basement, and there's pools of oil, with my stuff just floating in it. The oil filter on my burner rotted out. It was defective and recalled, but the tech never bothered to notify me or replace it. I call up the tech. He throws a new one on, charges me the emergency call fee, and advises I call HO insurance before running away. It was his fault, I didn't know it yet. This was in February in New York, about 13 Fahrenheit outside. Obviously, the burner wasn't on while sitting in a pool of oil, but they got there pretty quickly, soaked it up, and get things running so my pipes don't freeze. Only way to get the smell out is to dry clean absolutely everything I own. Then shampoo all the carpets, run deodorizers, etc. It takes weeks. Had a headache the whole time. Turns out my basement has cracks. Most of it just leaked through, so they had to cut out my foundation and dig out the contaminated soil. Oil and soil means DEC gets involved. Whole new can of worms, as they now have to monitor the process, test at every step. Big enough deal I have to spill a number in their database. A 20-yard dumpster with 20 yards of oil-soaked sand. It's so heavy that it broke through my driveway, absolutely destroying it. Well, they did that twice. Took out my entire driveway, mind you. Remember how I said this was in February? Well, March decides to roll around, bringing the COVID shutdown. I spent over a year with my basement in shambles, holes in my driveway, plastic sheets taped up, no washer, no dryer, and all sorts of equipment kicking around. So the next spring, they're back, they're working, and screwed up everything. Not going into every detail, but after a big fight, I managed to get rid of them and bring in a new company to fix their screw-ups and finally finish the job. Old crew, well, got very difficult when the new crew requested permits and reports. Turns out they never bothered. Had to do all that before they could even start working. New company dropped a storage crate on my yard to store my stuff while working, destroyed my grass, took out my sprinkler, took out my neighbor's driveway curb, got concrete all over my brickwork. But at least the nightmare was over. Story number 3. So I'll try to keep this sweet and short. I'm a beekeeper. My 3rd year of beekeeping, and I suddenly developed a severe allergy to bee stings. It was spring and I was installing bees for the beginning of the season. I was up to the last hive, went to install that package of bees, and one stung me right in the top of my head. I finished up a few minutes after and went up towards the house to do some things. I started feeling flushy, and I could feel my heart racing. After a few minutes, I realized I was having an anaphylactic shock. If you've ever had one of those, aside from the physical symptoms, they also say you will get a feeling of impending doom. That was spot on. I absolutely felt like I was going to die, and people do die from those reactions, so I'm now in the house and desperately searching for Benadryl, of which I have none. I'm also having trouble breathing, and my body's going haywire, and I feel like I'm going to black out shortly. I call my mother, who lives an hour away, to call emergency services because I feel like I'll be unconscious soon. She says okay. Calls 30 seconds later, it's my mom, and she says this. I called emergency services, but they said you have to call. Well, this was my first WTF. So, I call, and it's very typical emergency, saying she's trying to talk to me, and I essentially start vomiting. And so she's still on the line, and I'm waiting and waiting and waiting for this alleged ambulance. A full hour goes by. At this point, I'm actually coming out of the reaction, so I go to sit at my kitchen counter. I'm still on the line with the emergency dispatcher. I finally see the ambulance pull up, and I say, oh, they're here. She's like, great, are you okay? I'm like, yeah. And then she says goodbye and hangs up. So I see the emergency medical technicians outside, but my driveway has a gate, so they're just standing there and they ring the bell of the gate, and I'm just looking at them dumbfounded. Like, I called for an emergency over half an hour ago, and they're going to roll up here and ring the doorbell and wait for me to come out when I'm more than likely unconscious or dead on the floor. I literally had to go and let them in. Then they basically talked to me into going to the hospital to get checked out. Well, that was another huge mistake, because this took place in the 2 months in my entire life when I didn't have health insurance, so I end up having to pay $4,000 for a late ambulance and some IV Benadryl. Oh, which also reminds me, a paramedic also put the IV in when I agreed to go to the hospital. Then I felt something dripping. Turns out he put it in my artery rather than a vein, and it was just pushing fluid out of the IV. 0 out of 10 would not go through that again. But I did 10 years later when I had another reaction. You guessed it, due to a bee sting. However, this went a lot smoother, and now I have EpiPens and a responsive ambulance. Story number 4. A work friend of mine told me about a party where some of his friends decided to prank a mate. The target was one of the underdogs in the group, and he was often the butt of the japes. In advance of the party, the pranksters, well, they jigsawed a hole in the top of the coffee table that was going to be thrown out. With the cloth thrown over it, the coffee table looked fine. Anyways, when the party was well and truly underway at one point, the host suggested that they hold a seance. Everyone who was in the prank agreed, and a large group of guests clustered around the coffee table where, unbeknownst to the intended victim, one of the guests was hiding, concealed under the table and under the cloth. So, the seance started, and the host started intoning spookily something like, "Eddie, I hear a voice, Eddie. It's someone you know, Eddie." The guy at this point is white and starting to tremble while the room is chuckling behind their hands. The voice wants you to go closer to the table so you can hear their voice. Eddie, closer. Closer. Eddie's wide-eyed with terror at this point and goes close to the table. At a signal, the guy hidden underneath the table stuck his arm through the hole in the top of the coffee table as if a spooky form was rising up from the table's surface under the sheet. Well, Eddie flipped. Eddie freaked. While the room laughed and collapsed in tears, hyperventilating, screaming, and sobbing, thrashing around, he was past inconsolable. It seemed like he'd lapsed into absolute psychological breakdown. It didn't help at all when the prank was revealed to him. Well, as he laid on the floor, hysterical and literally inconsolable, one of the guests finally made the decision to call his mom, who was furious when she heard about the little prank because Eddie's father had passed away a few days before, and he didn't tell anybody. In the end, it seems they had to call emergency services and a medic arrived who sedated him. I don't know if he went in for observation or was allowed home, but you can bet that the host got grounded and butt-kicked by their parents. Well, left, right, and center after what they did. Story number 5. Well, this is a 21st birthday drinking story, so get ready. It's a bit of a read, but hey, the left turn's worth it. For people that live outside of the States, when you turn 21, it's the legal drinking age. There's a small 2-hour window from turning 20 to 21 at midnight before bars stop serving where you can drink. I'm talking midnight to 2 a.m. Anyways, few of my buddies wanted to have a good time and take me out. My mother told me, to swing by the house around 4 p.m. after my night out and we'd be going out for family dinner. My stepfather was going to a poker game with his brothers and would crash at his place. Little brothers all had sleepovers. So, I get picked up by my friends, sure as crap have a great time. Well, I woke up feeling like 5 pounds of poop in a 2-pound bag. Though I was thinking about food, that's for sure. I ring up my mother, who says to swing by stepdad, who isn't home yet. So buddies drop me off, and stepdad is not answering his phone calls, texts, etc. My uncle, whom he went to play poker with, said he never had a poker game. Well, calls go out to all family members. My aunt has a friend that was a cop, so she calls. Guess what? Stepfather was found about 40 miles away from home in jail. Guess what it was for? Trying to pick up a 14-year-old girl from the internet. So, here I sit, hungover, hungry. My little brothers are bawling their eyes out. My mom, she's losing her mind. Then my aunt says to turn on the local news. Sure as crap. To catch a predator, we see my stepfather walk in, and the house gets slammed against the wall by a handful of cops. 222 men were caught in the sting. Now, out of those 222 men, can you guess which one was willing to go on television and talk about getting caught? Ducking A, right? My stepfather, of course. Within the next 3 hours, phones would either be blowing up with text or calls. Everyone at my job knew because I worked with my stepdad. Few days pass, and my mom goes to the bank to get cash for bills. Good, gas, etc. Found out he drained the account the day after getting arrested to pay for his lawyer. Stepdad gets fired while in lockup, so now it's me, 21, working for $10 an hour supporting a family of 4, including myself. Mom files for divorce and a few weeks go by. So he's out. He's on bail living with his parents because he can't come home yet because there's minors present. Police show up a week later asking if he has any alibis for a handful of dates. Turned out he would on occasion pretend to be me when chatting with young girls online. I'm talking 1,600 pages of AIM chat logs recorded with various people pretending he was me. Thank Christ, the dates in question I was either with family that could confirm or I was at my other job electronically punched in. I get cleared, and he finally gets convicted and sentenced to a whopping 2 years in prison. End up losing our house, my 2 jobs, and had to briefly move out of state for a while. So you can say that was a wild day.